checking that. This morning we're going to share from Ephesians chapter 2 and talking about our citizenship and our belonging. Are we citizens of heaven or are we members of a failed state? It's up to us to realize and see our true identity and our true calling and our true belonging. And I think this passage in Ephesians chapter 2 is just so powerful and so relevant, as I said just now. So from verse 11, and I'll read to you from the NIV and share some of my thoughts that follow on after that. So the NIV text says from verse 11, "Therefore remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth. You were called uncircumcised by those who called themselves the circumcision, which was done in the body by human hands. And remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from the citizenship in Israel, and you were foreigners to the covenant of promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. He himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his own flesh the law with its commands and regulations. And his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. So consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens of God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too were being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit." There's just so much here in terms of peace, in terms of access, in terms of what God has done for us. But this issue of citizenship, belonging, passports and visas has been a bit of an issue in our house of late. I think most of you will be aware that Amy leaves in a couple of days. She's sitting behind the screen here. And she leaves in a couple of days for the UK for a year to pursue her studies and do her master's. And so all of a sudden, it's like, there's a long history, we won't share that, about where the passports have expired in our house and, the visas and all these things. And particularly at this time, you can't just, take your passport and your plane ticket and, arrive at the airport. You need now permission from Home Affairs and quarantining as you get to different countries and things like that. And, then chatting to friends of ours, she's going to stay in quarantine with Grant and Liz as she arrives in Nottingham, and chatting to them. And, then there are people even like Jenny Anderson, who's there with her family at the moment, who has an ancestral visa. And, so other people have, access to different countries and dual citizenships. And, I was thinking personally, I'm such a mongrel that, no one else will really take me. So I'm here, happy to be here. I don't know where I come from. I'm just, one of those people, they say, well, I'm South African, with all the bits and blogs and the genetic mix of whatever that is. But then as we think of our country, our economy, We know that every time there's a spike in crime, or there's a phase of load shedding, a season of load shedding, there's the immigration stats climb. People want to bail. They don't want to be here. They want to be, somewhere else. So again, I think this passage speaks to us in more ways than what we realize. Where do we truly belong? What is my nationality, my citizenship? And in a sense, the answer to that is that we realize as believers, as Christians, as those who love and follow Jesus, that we have a dual citizenship. And in terms of that, we then get to be challenged. I wanted to say decide, it's more than decide. We're challenged with how we should live. As citizens of those, when we look at our passport, when we fill in an application form, or as citizens of God's one family, household. Partakers of the divine kingdom. So as I read, and I was, as I said, just translating and just looking at this text, I was incredibly struck by the contrasts. It really is a passage of contrasts, how Paul juxtaposes one group against the other, and they're just such glaring disparities. It's a powerful picture of the gospel. And it starts with, on one level, it's a reminder to all of us, those of us that were not Jews by birth, we were outsiders. And Paul says that formerly, he says, remember, it starts off in verse 11, he says, I want to remind you that beforehand, you were outsiders. You didn't belong. You were Gentiles. He says you were uncircumcised outsiders, without Christ, alienated from the citizenship of Israel. We were strangers of the covenant of promise. We were without hope, without God, godless in the cosmos. That might be something that people are not as scared of in our day and age, but in the ancient world, in a world just filled with a plethora of gods, to say that you were godless in the cosmos was just an incredibly terrifying thing. Quite literally, those far away, the way we often term it today colloquially, as we talk about the lost. And Paul says here literally, you were afar off, but you've been brought near. So now, through Christ, Paul says, through his blood, through the cross, we who were far have been brought near. Christ has torn down, literally the word, it was one of the first words I learned in Greek. Luo is loose, but it literally means to tear down. Jesus has torn down the wall, the barrier of separation. He has abolished the laws of commands and regulations. He's reconciled us with Israel, and in that sense, the chosen people of God. We, the outsiders, have become insiders through the cross. And he has preached peace to us, that we would be at peace with the Father through the Spirit and with one another. He says we have access. I love that word. It's one of my favorite passages in Hebrews, but we have access to the one family, the one Father, in the one Spirit, Paul literally says. Fellow citizens. We citizens together. The word literally says, like, together citizens in one holy household of God. So as I've said, it is an incredible contrast. And I think, again, as we listen to this passage, as we read it, we're left amazed. We're blown away by what God has done for us. There's a sense in which we are amazed, we are in awe, and we call to live thankful lives, indebted, just in love with this God who has saved us and called us and made us one in his family. So I've said this so many times with Ephesians, these phrases, these texts, these reminders, says Paul, should really just galvanize us in this time of pandemic. They should fill us with hope, a sense of belonging, a sense of calling and purpose in our world. So just to pause and say, the problem is that traditionally we have read this passage and passages like this almost just in one dimension. I think as evangelicals, we've made this exclusively about salvation, our salvation, and all these terms and words and that, as amazing and as incredible as they are, and as we can spend our lives just in awe of it, we tend to focus on that one aspect and that one dimension. In a sense, we've made this all about us. And by that, I mean me. You know, it all becomes about just us personally, what God has done for me, for you, and our relationship with him. So we've landed on these incredible truths, that we're children of God, that we have access to the Father, and that's where we've stayed. But there is a bigger picture that Paul alludes to here. There is this plan for his entire cosmos. And in verse 15, right in the middle of this magnificent passage, there's in actual fact literally a purpose clause. And the purpose clause says that so that he may create in him, depending how you translate this, but literally it's like so that he may create in him the two into one. One new humanity making peace. And so that goes back to what we've shared. I've shared extensively about chapter 1. God's bigger plan for this planet, this God's plan of redemption, his plan for the entire cosmos, one new humanity. And so if you look at the words that Paul uses here in this, this passage of contrast, in actual fact, they're quite divisive ones. They're loaded terms. And for us, in this part of the continent, in the southern tip called South Africa, unfortunately, they're words that we are so well versed in. Paul says, remember formerly that you were Gentiles. The word there is ethne. And it's the word that we, from where we get our word ethnicity. So ethne, Gentiles, but ethnicity is a word with a dark and sordid past in this country. And then he says you were strangers. And the word strangers there is xenoi. And it's the word from which we get our word xenophobia. You were strangers. And again, we know from just the news and the context of our country is that we have not done well with strangers. And paroikoi, is foreigners, strangers and foreigners and ethnicity. And then Paul goes on, in verse 11, and he says we were Gentiles, but interestingly, the word that he uses there is he says, you were Gentiles called uncircumcised by those who are called circumcised. And so I've often referred to Genesis and God's covenant with Abraham, and we see in there this plan already there in Genesis, the plan for the whole world, the plan for Israel to be a blessing, a light to the nations. And the problem is not that Israel was called God's chosen people. It was that they resorted to name calling. The problem is not that they were circumcised, it's that they called everyone uncircumcised. And so we see there in Paul writing within the context of the Jews and the Gentiles, we see there the divisions, the enmity that has infected our whole world and our whole race. And that is in fact the word that Paul uses, literally enmity. As I was thinking about that and looking at that, the word means being in a state, a hostile state with one another, being in a state of enemy. And that is the result of the fall. This enmity has brought about these divisions, and not just divisions, but a state of hostility. So here in this passage in verse 14 and 15 and 16, Paul says there that Jesus literally, in his flesh, by going to the cross for us, he tore down the barrier of division. And he killed, in verse 15, it's thanatos, lovely Greek word that you can read about in mythology. But he put to death. Jesus went to the cross to die so that he would put to death the hostility that exists. And so we see here this incredible gift and plan. One new humanity, one body, one household of God, fellow citizens. So again, the powerful truths of this we have seen, and we preach them and we share them and we appreciate them. But so often, and maybe it's just me, some people I know, so often it's just about the division between us and God, the distance between God and ourselves. And we've celebrated that access into his presence, and we've enjoyed worship, but we have not remembered, and we have not pushed in with the truth that he came to demolish the divisions that were set into motion from the fall between Adam and Eve, between God's children, that we have seen throughout the history of Israel, throughout the history of the planet. And unfortunately, the bottom of this continent, we have done so incredibly well, in one sense, in making, just so much of these divisions, and making so much of the devastation of pushing ethnicity and strangers and foreigners and name calling and race and color and classes, etc., etc., etc. The list just goes on and on and on. The enmity and hostility has created divisions in relationships amongst races, amongst peoples, amongst classes, throughout humanity, between men and women, parents and children. As I said, the list goes on. And then we see, as Paul said in Galatians, just in another way, he said, God's plan, God's sacrifice was that there would no longer be Jew or Greek. There would no longer be male nor female. There would no longer be slave nor free. One new humanity, one body, one family. That's not only what he's called us to, but it's what he paid for and he's brought us into. So let me land on some of the consequences this morning. And it's a great word because Paul literally says in verse 19, he says, consequences. So the consequences of this. And just a couple, and I'll watch the time. I could go on about this all day. Firstly, the way we see ourselves. Obviously, this has a huge impact on the way we think of ourselves and how we fit in to God's world. So last week we talked about I reminded you about immersing ourselves in God's word. And just to pick up on that and to ask you, have you found a new pattern? Have you thought of a new routine? If you don't remember what I'm talking about, listen to the audio. Again, it's on the same YouTube channel or the website. But in reality, as we refresh and renew our minds in God's word, we renew our thinking, not in the ways in which we've learned to behave, but we renew our minds to the pattern that God has called us to. We learn to think anew. And the other thing is not just the way we see ourselves, but the way we name ourselves. Do we name ourselves? Do we echo the names that the world has called us? So the citizens of this world have thrown names about. I mean, we joke, I think young people a while ago, and that there was this, we joke about losers and, and nobodies and all kinds of things. Oh, you stupid, you this, you that, the other. Do we name ourselves according to the pattern of the citizenship of this world? Or do we name ourselves according to the new household of God, the new citizenship of God's kingdom? So do we name ourselves children, saints, holy, brethren, beloved, chosen, redeemed, belonging to him, forgiven, renewed, delivered, made new? Those are just some of the words used in the opening chapters of Ephesians. And then, how do we see others? Again, traditionally, evangelicals have even argued that Paul is talking just about the church. And so what we've done with this passage as Christians is we've created more divisions. Jesus comes to break the wall of division, and often the church has said, oh, that's great, let's raise a few. And we create these divisions. I remember in my early days of being a Christian, people said, oh, are you a Christian? I was like, yeah, but are you born again? So it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, but are you a born again Christian? And then you're like, well, at that stage, I didn't know what that meant. Anyhow, and then you go, well, yes, eventually you get born again, but are you spirit filled? And so often in our terminology, even, we start creating these different barriers. When I immersed myself again in church in the late 80s and recommitted my life and began to become familiar with these, it was quite common that the Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, all those, they were not part of the church. We raised a barrier there as well. And so within the church, we can talk about that. But that's the easy one. All I'm saying is that the church has done well of using this passage to again talk about insiders and outsiders. And yet, when we take a step back and we say, this is not just about whether you are yet a follower of Jesus. This is about God's heart for his whole world. Paul literally says here, the cosmos. Christ came to die, to sacrifice himself so that he might tear down all the barriers, that we would be at peace, that he came to preach peace to those that were near and to those that were far. And so in our country at this time, particularly with our just incredibly broken and dark history, the challenge is to see all of God's children, all of his people, as belonging, needing to belong, however you want to phrase it, but one new humanity. So I was thinking again of what I mentioned just now, of the name calling. In Rwanda, we've done it in South Africa, we've done it throughout history and throughout the world. But as we sort of reflected on the Rwanda massacre, it's interesting how different ethnicities, different tribes got into name calling. And often the names that were used were objectifying, not talking about people, men and women, as created in God's image, but objectifying them into things like trees, into things like, I remember Mzi telling me the one derogatory term in South Africa, I'm not sure if it's a Xhosa or a Zulu word, is talking about cockroaches. And so the words that we use in terms of these barriers is these people are cockroaches. And when we use those terms and we dehumanize, it's amazing to see in history how that leads to violence. Because people don't commit genocide against someone that they see like themselves and created in the image of God. But when you dehumanize them to an insect or an object or an inanimate object, well, then in Rwanda, the call went out, cut down the tall trees, as you would, a forest or whatever. So again, said this before, we love to generalize. Germans are so precise. The British are such snobs. The Americans are so arrogant. The Australians, they so uncouth. And, the list goes on and on and on. But we who have been brought in to this family, who has tasted of the promises of this new covenant, of this new household, we are called to be peacemakers, children of peace. Going back then to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers. The peacemakers shall be called children of God." Another word that Paul used is ambassadors. And in the context of Ephesians, where peace just pervades this letter, the challenge to us is to be ambassadors of peace. The challenge is to have this access which brings peace in our hearts, that fills us with joy and hope, but that causes us to be ambassadors for one new household, one new humanity. In that sense, we're called to be advertisements of a new world, a new order. Well, that's a loaded term. One new humanity. So God calls us to be profoundly impacted by his peace. He preached peace to us so that we would be changed, transformed, renewed, but that we would embody it and become peacemakers, advertisements for this one new household and this one new humanity. My time is up. This morning I have a lot more to say about that, but let's pause this morning. We've gone 10 o'clock, and I'd like us to just close with just one application, one simple application of this. And I learned this at the conversation seminar a few weeks ago. And so I want to ask you just to think now of some of the relationships that you're in, some of the divisions that are closer to home in your life. And that becomes relational. It's not about our country. It's not about our neighbors. It's not about the politics. It's about your relationships. So can I ask you just to sit quietly, to close your eyes? And I'd like you to think for a moment of a relationship that you are thankful for, that you're grateful for. And would you just, on your lap, or if you raise your hands, or just simply comfortably as you're sitting, just open your left hand and picture the relationship that you're grateful for. And then I invite you to be reminded of a strained relationship, a relationship that is hard or broken. A person that you're not at peace with. And I just invite you to picture that person in your right hand, and just to hold them there. And I just invite you to bring your hands to your heart, to hold close to your heart the relationships that are at peace, and the relationship that we in hostility, enmity struggle with. And Jesus, we thank you that in your body, in your flesh, you hold both, Lord. You brought both together to make peace. And we ask you, Lord, we ask you in our world and in our lives, we say, would you let your kingdom come? Would you break through and let us see the barriers and the walls that you abolished? Our heart's cry is that in our heart they would come down, that they would be one, and that we would experience the one new humanity, the kingdom, the family that you purchased.